Hello you guys, it's Riikka Kovasin here with another project. This time I'm making a canvas of sorts. I'm using this heavy chipboard kind of tag shape for my base, and I'm first covering it using acrylic paints. While the paints are still wet, I'm covering the whole thing, and while some of the paints are still wet, I then add water splashes on top, so the paint underneath those splashes won't dry when I use the heat tool, and then I'm able to lift some of the paint off, getting this kind of a worn or a little splodgy look. I'm going for this old wall kind of feel for this project as the background. When I then have this greenish layer finished, I then add a pattern on top. I'm using this brass colored paint and AB Studio stencil and creating this kind of a leaf pattern to the background. I'm using the same stencil in a later stage to create a dimensional layer, but at this stage I'm doing just flat layers. I then use a fan brush to add some splashes and then dry the canvas. I also use the brass paint to color the kind of a ring enforcer or a hole reinforcer for the project. I then add some collaging on top. I'm using a matte medium and these little strips I torn from the strips so they have a little bit more texture that way. I'm adding the pieces here and there, but in the end I'm covering the whole surface with the medium, so it's kind of uniform of a layer, so there's not places where there wouldn't be any medium, because when I add the layers on top I don't want the different sections to react differently. I'm using the same medium also to add here the little ring in place. After that, I'm then letting the project dry for a while and then add the dimensional layer on top. For that, I'm using the same AB Studio stencil, but this time using modeling paste, so I have these dimensional leaves coming on top. What I also did, as you can see, I made some die-cut elements for this canvas and also chose a bunch of die cuts to be added. I'm now kind of sketching the composition here to know which element I'm going to use. I had these kind of florals also chosen, but in the end I decided to go with just the leaves, kind of this a little bit hanging wreath kind of composition. I then remove everything and start inking. I'm first adding some ink to the edges of the bigger elements, kind of a grounding element for the professor that's coming on top. And then I add also some inks to the background. For the edges I'm using distress inks, and for the background I'm using oxides. I'm playing with a couple of colors, vintage photo and scorched timber. When I have added the inks to the background, I let the project dry for a while inking some of the elements I created. So I'm turning the little wreath I cut, like a twig wreath, into a darker color and also adding inks to those clovers I got earlier. For the wreath I'm using scorched timber, and for the clovers I'm then using two different green colors. I'm also inking around the edges of the elements I'm going to layer on top. The main composition needed a little bit more something, so I tore a couple of pieces of corrugated cardboard and then adding those underneath the die cut. I then add the frame in place, but also add some natural twine hanging from the wreath, adding another texture that way. I'm using a stapler to attach those as well. When I then have this center of attention or focal point done, or background for him, I then mount the professor on top using foam tape and then start the composition of the kind of falling leaves. I'm now using just foam tape, but I did add some craft glue underneath because it's such a textured surface and not like paper on paper, so the mere foam tape wouldn't hold everything in place nicely. For the main composition, or the kind of leafy part, I'm then using the die cuts and the, die cut clovers as the elements. I'm speeding things up and kind of just showing you pieces of the composition coming along, not the whole thing. As you can see, I'm making quite quick decisions about the placement of the elements. I first kind of try things out a little bit and then adhere them in place. When I have the paper elements done, I'm adding a couple of metal embellishments to the main cluster as well, and then make this sentiment in a way, or the title of the piece, using two elements. The other one is from the die cut set and the other one is a metal plaque. To highlight especially the plaque, so it's more readable, I used this minty colored paper artsy paint. I also treated the little insect using the same paint. And now I'm using the same paint to add some splashes in there. I first guarded the professor because I didn't want green splashes all over his face, but then added a little bit near him as well to make him more part of the whole thing. Here's some detail shots, and if you want to see a bigger, better photo of the finished project, you'll find that in my blog. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you liked the video. There's a materials list in the description box as always. Thanks again. Bye!